I'm going to start with the most incendiary question of the day. No pun intended. And this is, okay.
Why do you think it's to you, Greg?
To create plant lists, fire-prone plant or fire-resistant plants, are you relying on scientific research or on shared experience of recent fires? What is the current status on using plant lists?
Yeah, I think I'll pass it on. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, this might actually go backwards. I don't know how it works.
Could you repeat the question?
The question was about fire-resistant plant lists specifically, whether there's any science behind it or whether it's just anecdotal evidence, experience. I think it's largely anecdotal evidence and experience on the fire-resistant plant lists. The fire-safe marin is, we think, one of the first fire-resistant plant lists published in the early 90s in cooperation with UC Cooperative Extension. We have some qualms with it. We don't think it's necessarily the best approach now. We don't think our list is comprehensive enough. There are a lot of plants on it that are not natives. We've had to cull out invasive plants over the years because our understanding of some of those species has changed. We're leaning much more towards publishing guidelines and recommendations to the characteristics of plants than the specific species, especially for fire-resistant plants. And we hear a lot of times that there's no science at all. I think Greg's shown us that there is some science. There aren't any peer-reviewed studies that we're aware of that say this plant burns at X number of degrees and this one doesn't. That said, the fire-prone plant lists are a little different. It's a much shorter list. We publish that. They're virtually all non-natives except for a handful of conifer tree species that we have a vast amount of experience with that just aren't appropriate for landscaping around homes. Juniper, Italian cypress, pampas grass, and a handful of others are just dramatic examples. We don't need any science. I don't need a peer-reviewed study. I've seen it myself with my own eyes. You all have. We've got videos to show how those particular plants react to fire where other ones don't. Do you want to add anything, Greg?
Thank you. So in San Diego County, our suggested plant list, and I like that it's suggested, not required. I think that's a good approach because honestly, the longer I've been at this, the less I tend to agree with fire lists or feel that for all but a few species, I wouldn't be planting like chamise around under the eaves of my house, that's for sure. And I hate juniper. Oh my God, that stuff burns. And the thing, but as Todd was saying, a lot of it has to do with the characteristics of the plants themselves, small leaf size, oil content, that kind of thing. But I've also had ground cover forms of chamise in gardens, in front yards, that did extremely well in fires because they're low growing and because they were hydrated. And really, we want to really start to emphasize the importance of hydration and foliar hydration in these concepts. But most of the lists, the exclusionary lists I'm seeing aren't too bad, to be honest with you. I don't have too much problem with them. Anybody else?
So just to add on, I think if you're asking a question, you're almost missing the point, which is you need to be focusing on how you care for the landscape and how you maintain it. You're not going to be able to pick a plant palette from a list that doesn't burn and that doesn't need care. And if that's what you're trying to do, we've wasted our whole day today. So to that end, they almost become more or less irrelevant, at least in terms of fire-safe plant lists.
Wonderful. Now let's move from fire to water. So there seems to be a little bit of controversy. I've heard several people murmuring. Traditionally, we've heard that drip irrigation is the way to go. And we have heard that some overhead watering can encourage diseases. So we seem to be now hearing that some overhead irrigation is great. Are we on the, at the beginning of a paradigm shift or a revolution in irrigation here? Any thoughts? Whoever wants.
I mean, I don't know exactly what the right answer is here. I think it depends on what you're doing, it depends on what you're irrigating, it depends on what you are working with. I don't think that there's like, I wouldn't say like absolutely this way or that way, but depends on your site and the conditions.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. It really does depend. However, when I'm talking to people about irrigating their plants, it's typically in a very like residential, highly populated areas. It's not out in like unincorporated areas. We have learned, or at least I was taught, that pop-up sprinklers, the kinds we used to use in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of evaporation rate. The water didn't even make it to the plants. However, when I have a little bit more time to go through a program, in addition to irrigation, I do encourage people to just hose off their plants about once a month, just to like get dust off of them, just to like hydrate areas. But I'm really curious about hearing what you're talking about with the whole practice of those micro pop-up sprays for natives. I mean, that blew my mind. So I'm really pumped to learn more about these other practices when we are looking at strictly native landscapes.
That's okay. No, I'm just kidding. All right, guys. So, yeah, this has brought me knowing the controversy, and you remember that I'm a Bert Wilson disciple. So this started back in 1985, okay? So what is the general concept here? The general concept is that these ecosystems, we're trying to create ecosystems, we're trying to create symbiotic associations of plants. We're trying to encourage the development of mycorrhizal fungi and all kinds of biological organisms that we have yet to even identify. It is impossibly complex. We'll never understand all the variables, but guess what? They're all interdependent. So how do you do this? What you do in our philosophy that has really dropped our mortality rates down to under 10%. We try to emulate the natural ecology as much as we know how to, and not introduce anything foreign to the system. For us, drip irrigation is swamp ecology. It creates localized hypersaturation zones of anaerobic bacteria instead of overhead. Well, how does Mother Nature water her plants, guys? Okay, who here thinks you cannot overhead water a native plant? If anybody says that, ask them, how does Mother Nature do it? Okay, so that process of hitting leaves, infiltrating through the mulch, because the mulch isn't just a nice top dressing to keep the weeds down. Mulch is an integral part of the biosystem, okay? And the mulch begets the plant community, and the plant community gets the mulch, and it's a chicken and egg, and when you have to jump into that cycle to do a new landscape, that's why we use shredded redwood bark, because for us it's the closest thing to that natural duff layer that forms in heavily dense wooded plant communities. So part of that equation is we give them rainfall. And what we use is we use a product typically called MP rotators. Are those popular up here?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so they're made by Hunter. I will let you know that, full disclosure, several members of the Hunter family are actually my clients, okay? But I didn't start using MP from Hunter. They were developed in Walla, Washington by a little company up there, and I tested some of the prototypes in the late 80s, early 90s. And it was manna from heaven. 0.49 inches of 0.39 inches of precipitation an hour. It's perfect. And so we wash off the plants. And oh, by the way, I do like hand watering too. We call that beer watering. You grab a beer, you grab the hose. When you've done the beer, you've done water, okay? Works great. But aside from beer watering, I love overhead irrigation on a PV system, 12-inch pop-ups with what were called swing joints. So remember the old days is you trip on a sprinkler head, you bust it right there, you have to dig up 20 feet of pipe to fix it. No, now it's isolated and it's on a little adjustable universal joint. Works wonders. If you've got really small planters, we go to microsprays. And we use strip microsprays that only have 2 strings on each, one on each side, and we put them in between a pair of plants. That way you never have any blocking, and yet you still have that diffuse application. Or we'll use microsprays on stakes, or we'll even use these very flow adjustable heads that have multiple orifices, because that's sort of like, at least it's giving us a more diffuse application. We really try to avoid single point emitters at all costs. And it has worked incredibly well, repeatedly. Plants seem to love it, and it just seems to be as close to the ecosystem as we can get it. Yeah, anybody else?
One last thing. Part of the question addressed diseases. So I can pretty much say that the overhead watering is not going to be necessarily the cause of the disease. What we always want to do is identify what the disease is and what plant that disease is on, and then from there we can talk about what's going on with that equation. So it's not necessarily going to be because of overhead watering.
Okay, let's move on to soils. It sort of seemed like Aristotle was fire, earth, air, and water, right? Okay, so there's an interesting comment I know that Greg made about how native plants don't normally need any soil amendments. But we're thinking about how we have the situations in native chaparral, woodland, forest ecosystems where there's a long history of natural development of mycorrhizae and the whole soil profile. What about our urban or suburban situations where we don't have that history? How would we get mycorrhizae into our soil? How do we know it's there? Is there some type of heavy, inorganic, chemical intensive soil preparation that we should do?
Is there a missing step?
Huh? Yeah, there might be some. Anyways.
Yes, there's definitely ways to introduce can you hear me? Sorry. Yes, there's definitely ways to introduce the mycorrhizals into your soil that are organic and that without having to use any of the heavy fertilizers. It can be either by just getting the microorganisms, or you can do just compost. Like just having even just making your own compost at home. If you have, I live in San Francisco, I have a very small space, but I have a warm compost bin, so all of my food scraps go in there, and that is just filled with all kinds of microorganisms that then I put in the soil, and that builds the soil without really having to use any heavy chemicals. Again, I'll just put it again, P, it's great, fertilizer. So, yeah, but there's no need to put any chemicals in your landscape. It can all be done organically, even in the city. Like, I have a beautiful garden in my apartment in the middle of San Francisco. It's just filled with flowers right now. It's really incredible, and no chemicals have been used.
Just because something's in the city doesn't necessarily mean that it's in worse shape too than something that's in a suburban or a rural area. Actually, I think there was a study in Manhattan a couple of years ago. They did some soil sampling in Central Park, and they found incredible biodiversity there. And all the soil scientists were blown away. They did not expect to find this kind of diversity in the middle of Manhattan. And then, conversely, you can go out to the middle of Iowa and find things that are completely devoid of nutrients. And some of what's happening is that the plants that are chosen to be planted, if you're planting a monoculture, then you're just effectively giving whatever is living in the soil the same thing to eat 24/7. And one of the themes that's emerged today is having this complexity and this biodiversity, and nature wants complexity, it needs complexity, it builds and it tends towards complexity. So you get that complexity by having a variety of different plants, right, in your garden that will put those exudates out, that will attract the right kind of biology in your soil ecosystem.
So if you're wondering how you get that fairly quickly, if you've got native plants that you want to introduce mycorrhizate for, just go out into nature and find a stand of those native plants out there. Grab some duff, put in a little cup or something like that. That cup is going to contain millions of spores of those mycorrhizal fungi, and you can simply sprinkle a little bit of that around your plant. You will inoculate your soil with those very mycorrhizal organisms that the plant has evolved with. So that's, and the next thing I want to sort of, forgive me, I'll try and keep this short. I've got a little bit of a problem with packaged mycorrhizae because remember when we went through and we were talking about insects earlier in this conference, and we were sitting down saying, yeah, we may not actually know all the insects that are even out there. Trust me, insects are really easy to find and categorize compared to subterranean fungi. So we, at best, probably only know 80% of the fungi that are out there in our soils of California. And for other parts of the world, that's probably as low as 20% of the ones we know. Got a little bit of a problem with bringing in exotic mycorrhizae, picking it out of a package, sticking it in the ground and putting it in. Because one of the problems we've had with native plants here is that we're bringing in all these exotics and putting, we can't even tell you what we're losing in terms of native mycorrhizae because we don't even know what we have. So I would encourage you to go out and just grab a handful of stuff, put it in your garden that matches the biome that you're trying to emulate in that garden, and it'll sort itself out.
Real quick, yeah, we don't inoculate. In fact, mycorrhizal spore is ubiquitous, it's everywhere. We have the same concerns about introducing foreign spore, and if you have a well-grown native plant in a pot that's healthy, a lot of the time that actually becomes the inoculum for your site when you plant it. Okay, and it moves out about 3 to 6 feet a year as it goes. So typically, even in really crappy, in fact, I love subgraded soil because there's no weeds and there's no pathogens. So we dig a hole, stick it in, they do fine. Natives are adapted, amazing that way.
Okay, there's another very interesting question here that I think I'm going to take because I think it deserves some good attention. It's what part of California's biodiversity is made up of invasive plants? And I think we have to go back and really define the two terms maybe a little better. Biological diversity has many components. So there's the number of species. There's also the evenness of the species. All have to be present in healthy populations to have a diverse a high measure of biodiversity. And then also there's genetic diversity, goes on and on and on. So then there's also invasive. Not all non-native plants, which are often called exotic plants, are invasive. The term invasive means that a particular species is spreading at the expense of others. So
Humans.
When we talk about biological diversity of California, if we want to have a high biological diversity of California, we want many species. We also want their populations to be healthy enough so that some of them are not on the verge of extinction. And then we also can say that we can add other species which may add to our richness, which is the total number of species. But if they become invasive and start crowding out other species, we're going to lower diversity because the populations of the other species are going to decrease, and then we may lose some of the native species to extinction. So it's a very interesting question. Thanks for who put this down here. And we have to say that a lot of the introduced plants can provide certain habitat value for native species, but they're often the generalist species. So Art Shapiro, who's a lepidopterist up at UC Davis, published a very interesting paper about how many of the butterflies in the city of Davis were subsisting on introduced plants. And then you just have to remember that butterflies, those particular butterflies that he was mentioning, are the generalist feeders. They're not restricted to one species of plant. But there are a lot of species of butterflies and moths and many other insects that are restricted to one species of plant. So it's a very complex picture, but generally we would say that invasive plants tend to decrease the biological diversity of California rather than increase it. Okay, anybody else?
Brilliant. Yeah, I think.
Okay, all right. Okay then. Okay, Linda, what about your question? So this actually gets back to the last question. Maybe I should have piggybacked on the last question. If an oak tree has armillaria, and the arborist recommends a fungicide, are there alternatives? So we know that fungicides in general can tend to hurt the soil microflora, okay? And we also know that we have several problems. I mean, you mentioned armillaria. We also have of course, sentinel death, Phytophthora. Are there some of these treatments that could actually hurt the soil, and are there some alternatives?
I'll start. Okay, so there are no known chemical treatments for armillaria, so that's just going to be right off the bat. There are treatments for armillaria, but the treatments for armillaria, for the most part, involve, it's a little bit complicated, but it involves using an air spade or something else that simply picks up the soil, gently moves it away from the root system, dries everything out, and interrupts the mycelial network that armillaria uses. So armillaria is the biggest armillaria infections are miles wide. It is moving nutrients through the soil, moving nutrients from a dead stump to go overwhelm the host defenses of a living stump someplace else, or a living tree someplace else. So if you can interrupt those mycelial highways, then you can interrupt armillaria's ability to attack another tree. So that's one of the major reasons you're simply blowing things with air. You're using air to interrupt these in a way that destroys the mycelial network without destroying the tree's underlying root network, if you will. But that said, once armillaria is big and established in a tree, it's a little bit like trying to close the barn door after the horse is out. It's not really all that effective. And there is nothing you're going to apply to that tree. Now, we're talking about one disease on one oak. So there are a lot of fungicides in particular that people will often use to try and treat various different maladies. Propiconazole is one of the big ones that's popular right now. Propiconazole is a systemic fungicide. I'm not going to be able to tell you in every instance where it's better or worse, but let's think about this. You're applying a systemic fungicide to an organism that relies on mycorrhizal networks in order to really thrive and survive. I liken it, like any analogy, it breaks down, but I liken it to taking antibiotics. You have a gut flora that you rely on to survive and process food. If you take antibiotics, you're screwing that up. And that's not helping you, although it may be a lot better than the streptococcus that's chewing up your arm or whatever you're taking it for. So the only time I can think of that that systemic fungicides in general would be warranted is when you really know that you have a very dire situation and you've sat down and considered the costs to the plant. And there may be instances where those kinds of things are warranted, but it's not sort of a thing like you say, oh gee, my plant's sick, let's throw some propiconazole on it and see if it gets better. That's sort of the bass-ackwards way of going about problem solving.
I can add to what we've done sometimes. It's funny, I've heard people speculate armillaria is a way for oak trees to kill off competition, but anyway. We've had some pretty good luck with phosphoric acid treatments on Phytophthora, but we're talking about Cinnamomii down there. Thank God in San Diego we don't get enough rainfall to really support the sod down there. I was very reluctant to use it, but it was reported that it had no ill effect on mycorrhizal fungi, and we actually have brought some trees back by using it as either a bark penetrant treatment or as a agrifos is what it's called, or a cambium injection, pretty well knocking out the apparent Phytophthora, and also really good with anthracnose on sycamore. So they have that problem up here.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's been incredibly effective with sycamores doing it at the right time, just as buds are swelling. So we have had good luck with that. It doesn't appear to be. I'm always nervous about putting phosphorus around mycorrhizae, but that's usually endomycorrhizae. And if it's ecto, I don't know that it's such a big problem. So.
Okay, now we have a question about another type of list. We've heard about fire-resistant or non-fire-resistant plant lists. We do have lists of pollinator plants. I know that Gordon Frankie's group from UC Berkeley has done a lot with those. What about carbon sequestration plant lists? Does anybody, can anybody talk about that?
Well, we did talk a little bit about redwood trees, and they are carbon sequestration heroes. So if you want to plant or help replant redwoods in appropriate places, I'm not sure that San Diego would be one, but they are really, they take the cake. And then there are other trees, locust trees are big carbon sequestration giants, and there's something called the Empress Tree, which some people consider to be an invasive, but it grows really quickly, and because it grows super quickly, it it absorbs a ton of carbon as it's growing. So if you think of growing trees like growing teenage boys, perhaps, they just inhale a lot of food to reach that growth spurt.
How about smaller stuff?
I haven't studied the literature on the smaller stuff. I just on the trees.
To one degree, I mean, trees are carbon. The bigger the tree is, the more carbon you're sequestering. The faster it grows, the more carbon you're sequestering. So almost by definition, smaller trees sequester less carbon. Now that gets a little bit iffy in some places, because one of the things you don't really see is how big that plant is underground. So there are some, say, perennial grasses in California that can have remarkably good carbon profiles, despite the fact that they don't look like all that much above ground. So I don't know of a good plant list. The problem being, of course, that most of the plant lists you could generate are very sort of location specific. We can't even generate one for California because you can't grow redwoods in San Diego. Well, you can try and grow redwoods in San Diego.
Plant them in the middle of the lawn.
Right. There you go. But as soon as we move inland, or as soon as we move too far north or too far south, the plant palette changes. So I think that's going to hamper developing plant lists that are widely applicable in California. Although looks like Laura has something to contribute on this.
Well, I guess what I would ask is, do all plants sequester an equal amount of carbon for their scale? I mean, redwoods are the biggest, so yes, of course they do the most. But is each plant processing and storing the same amount of carbon for its size?
So do I need to repeat that for the?
Yes.
Okay, so the question is, do all plants sequester the same amount of carbon for their size? And the answer to that is no. If you like Bermuda grass or corn, this is your place, because the C4 plants are going to sequester carbon at much higher rates, particularly under warmer and warmer environmental conditions. So that's something that people are going to be looking at in the future. So just for there are different kinds of plants, but one kind of photosynthesis or metabolic process, we should say, is called C4, which is Bermuda grass and corn and a few of these other monocot species, as opposed to C3, which is almost every other plant in the world. The C4s tend to be adapted to tropical climates and hot weather, and they're much more efficient at carbon dioxide capture pound for pound. So that gives them a competitive advantage, and that's one of the reasons Bermuda grass is so hard to eradicate. But I'm babbling on too long. Did you have a question?
I had a comment.
Okay, please.
Yes, so I was just going to reframe the question a little bit and say, how can I have the biggest impact on this planet? And I would say that at the end of the day, global warming is huge, and I would make a side pitch and say, like, the t-shirt I'm wearing is from the League of Conservation Voters, which is a super PAC, which works on the elections to identify politicians which are the most anti-global warming. And and look at your investments, and also go green in investments in your 401ks, wherever you can. So that was a side pitch.
Yes, we are going to get to some more complex questions in a minute, but we have a set of questions.
Could we take this a little bit, could we talk about this a little bit more? Because doesn't some of the carbon sequestration have to do with the root depth, that you're actually storing the carbon not in the up?
Right, and I think that's what Steve was saying, the native grasses. Some of the common native bunch grasses that are sold and being used in landscaping a lot.
But
For
probably
example,
not
California.
just grasses. It's probably not just grasses. I think just root depth in general would be a characteristic to consider.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Well, there is a question that's very similar to that, and that's there's a set of questions about ground covers, which I think actually bring in some of these different questions, or different aspects. So we know that we're trying to break the fuel ladder. We know there's some areas where we're going to have definitely low vegetation. So there's interest here in ground covers that will be good at carbon sequestration, ground covers that will be good for pollinators. What other benefits can we get from using particular kinds of ground covers?
What other
that are not lawns?
Do you want to know what benefits we can have from growing ground covers?
And I think which ones?
Which
native
ones?
ground covers?
Which native ground covers are?
More carbon?
And will also be good for pollinators.
Okay. And be fire.
What are the best ground covers? Yeah, I mean, I don't know. The low-growing ceanothus is one that's coming to mind.
Well, there's some native ground covers like the beach strawberry and
Beach strawberry.
that's a good one.
Yeah.
There's some native Argentophilis that
Artis-
stay well.
Yeah, right. We were just talking about that right before getting on the panel. Like, what are some good plants for this? Maybe I should.
Some of the coyote brush.
Coyote brush.
That's what we were thinking.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's Argentophilis. And then when there's come on, I just said it. Buckwheat. Thank you.
Buckwheat, yes.
Harry Hognam.
And so don't forget what was mentioned earlier, that when you have a ground cover, then you are cooling the ambient temperature, right? And you're also retaining the moisture in the system, which is going to, by definition, lessen the fire danger and so forth. So this idea of hydrating your landscape and keeping it hydrated is part of lowering your risk of fire danger and lowering all the variables that we call climate change. So climate change isn't just about carbon, it's also about water vapor and these other gases, methane and nitrous oxide, and it's a whole system. So we're trying to get the system back in balance. And so maybe the ground cover you pick isn't a carbon powerhouse, but it might have these other co-benefits for pollination or for moisture retention that are equally important.
Yes, I'll just real quick. I touched on this in the talk, and in the research that I've done, and I'm no expert on mycorrhizae, okay? But there's a type of mycorrhizae that inhabits most of the grassland, desert, coastal sage scrub type communities, which is called arbuscular mycorrhizae or endomycorrhizae. And I've seen repeatedly referenced that endomycorrhizae sequesters 27% of the world's carbon production in the form of glomalin, which is they form little tubules, the mycelia, through the soil to transport the sugars and minerals and water. And those get sloughed off but left behind in the soil, and they're carbon compound or organic compounds, organic polymers. And so, like I said, I'm no expert, but I would imagine that plants that are of that group, like Baccharis, Eriogonum, Salvias, Artemisia, which also I think might be C4, I'm not sure, but anyway, those might, I would think, and remember also that the mycorrhizal volume, the biomass, is many times that of the individual root systems of the plants. It's a tremendous amount of biomass that permeates the upper 3 feet of soil. So I would think things that support that kind of ecology are probably pretty damn good carbon sequestering plants that don't necessarily have to be huge trees. So.
Good ground covers also hold steep hills. Sorry, hold what?
So the comment was that good ground covers also hold steep hills.
Okay, we have a couple of questions, a bunch of questions that fall into two categories. One set is of what an individual can do to begin to transform a piece of land that maybe has had another use into a thriving wildlife habitat sanctuary. And the related one is if you don't have a half acre or it's a very small space, what contribution can you make? I think that we've had some answers already. I think Patricia gave us the example of the map of San Francisco. Your one particular garden may not by itself be significant, but if it's connected or close enough to a lot of other neighboring patches, it can be great. And then of course, here in Marin, we also have open space areas that may be close enough to your garden to provide the inoculum for native wildlife to come in. And then as far as the transformation of where do you start? I think maybe Greg gave us some suggestions, but maybe if anybody has any further information to add on those things.
I mean, I would say always start by listening, and I mean like really listening to the land, listen to what it wants, not just assume like, oh, well, it wants to be this or that, but sit with it, like listen to the land, listen to the wind. What is the wind doing? What, like, you know, I think in the permaculture principle, they always say like, observe your land for a whole year so that you can see it through all of the seasons and see what's happening, see what are the species that are already coming, are there migratory birds passing through there in the spring that maybe you're not seeing in the winter, but you have to notice that so you know that this tree, although maybe it doesn't seem like it belongs there, but it's creating habitat. Or, you know, maybe there is a water stream that only reveals itself in the winter. So I think taking the time to know your land, to listen with all of your, feel it with all of your senses, and have your approach come from that place of having heard what it wants. And then you can decide, okay, like I think this is the best approach to go with this. And maybe it doesn't quite fit what your idea of what you wanted it for this place, right? But it is what's best for the land. Anybody?
I would say be brave. I was just thinking of a friend of ours that lives in Carmichael, and he lives on a cul-de-sac where every single house has a front lawn in front of it, all the way down. And when he and his family moved in, they tore up the lawn, they planted a variety of fruit trees, they sheet mulched the whole thing, they put in blueberries, they put in peaches, they put in, you name it, and it stuck out like a sore thumb, and all the neighbors came and said, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" And he said, "Oh, you know, I'm planting fruit trees." And sure enough, You know, the fruit trees attracted beneficials, created shade, and all the neighborhood kids would come over and get the peaches and the plums and the jujubes and all the wild stuff that they're growing. And then the next neighbor decides, well, maybe I can plant one tree in my lawn. But sometimes, you know, you just have to go against the grain and say, like, I'm going to listen to the land, but I'm also going to do something that I know is right, but might not be popular aesthetically.
And I can share, be patient and know that mistakes might happen, but then we learn from those mistakes to move forward and create something even better.
And I'd like to add that a landscape is a little bit like this conference, in that it's a conversation between you and the land. And this conference will present all kinds of fun things up here that are what we understand them to be now. But just like fire-safe plant lists, they may not be relevant or particularly useful now, but research will be ongoing. And those truths that we're talking about today may change. So just keep an open mind about the fact that our knowledge today is imperfect, and as we move forward, the landscape that we're sitting on in terms of fire is changing with us.
I think it's well said, actually.
Could I add something to that? There's a movie called The Biggest Little Farm, I think is the name of it. If you haven't seen it, watch it. There's a lot of good information in that in terms of like what can happen, what you can do with a piece of property that the water runs off of has been conventionally farmed.
If you have a lot of money.
Well, no, not even that. You can move into a place that's just bare earth. But the other thing I want to say is we're looking at all of it. We're so damn human-centric, period. Everything we're doing, whether we're going to buy ourselves a new Tesla or whether we're going to ride a bicycle or whatever it is, we're still human-centric, and we're leaving out 99.9% of whatever life has been on this planet forever. And we're pretty out of balance. So yeah, listen to the land and all that, but still underneath it all, we're still being driven by money and our desires, and we want to, like, we drive here, for example, how much carbon is in us driving around and buying all this stuff, and just in our Amazon boxes we throw out week after week. It's like, we don't even look at that stuff. It's just human-centric. And I'd say start with try and look at things, try to grow down a bit. Look at kids. Why do we stop like wearing fairy costumes and climbing trees? Seriously, it's because we kind of worry about what other people think rather than going out and rolling around on the ground and just feeling and exploring. Go out and explore and just see what comes. And check out The Biggest Little Farm. It really is a lot of good information in there.
Did that get caught on the camera?
What's that?
Did that get caught? Or did we need to paraphrase that?
I'm not sure how much the microphone will pick it up from back here, but probably some of it.
There's also a
check out the Little
book
Biggest
out
Farm.
right
Yeah.
now called Nature's Best Hope by Doug Callamy, that is biologist from University of Delaware, telling people to plant natives in their gardens in order to, have a bigger ecosystem than we have in the natural world to help the insect apocalypse and the bird decline.
And one last.
I would recommend that book.
What's the name?
Nature's Best Hope by Doug Callamy, Tallamy.
I was going to say one more thing that you can start today, and that's your compost. So start your compost at home, build your own soils. If all of a sudden you now have this beautiful piece of land that you're going to be stewarding, build your own soil, get to know your soil, and like build that, because we can do this. We don't need to bring it from other places. It's right at our fingertips to do it.
And even the water that we use, it's all pumped around with electricity. It's like we pump it through the drip or through the whatever, but personally I think there's value in using our water for attracting bees or feeding wildlife, for example, than doing a lot.
Okay, thanks. There's a very interesting set of questions that may be the perfect questions to end on, and these are related to how do we scale up from my individual house or garden to the neighborhood level. So how do we coordinate? We've already seen some great examples with CERT, I think, here in Marin, and with fire-safe neighborhoods. But are there ecologically sustainable neighborhood mechanisms that we can work towards? Are there grants that neighborhoods can apply for so that they can actually restore their local environments using many of the techniques that have been discussed here. Does anybody know of any of those mechanisms or resources?
Great question.
So for this, there's a whole series that UC has online called Forest Stewardship Workshops. Now you may not have a patch of forest, but what this is oriented toward is the small landowner who owns, say, half an acre to 5 acres to 10 acres of forest land and doesn't really understand how they can reach out to a broader audience, reach into the larger world and work with folks to get grants and those kinds of things. And generally what this means is you're going to probably end up having to work with your neighbors. Now, that's probably true about fire anyway. If you're like 90% of us, you don't have 100 feet between your house and the neighbor's house. Your biggest threat to your house is your neighbor's house catching on fire and setting your house on fire. So the best thing you can do in terms of if you live in a suburban or urban neighborhood is work as a community to help fire save your community, at least block by block. That same principle, though, does apply to those of us who live in more rural communities, because the fire is not going to care about whether you manage your landscape in one particular way necessarily. It's going to burn the area. So if you can treat the area, then you're better off. So to that end, you need to start thinking about resource conservation districts. Those exist in places. The National Resource Conservation Service, I know it sounds like it's the same thing, it's not. The National Resource Conservation Service is a federal program, and they started as the Soil Conservation Service, maybe some of you remember that. They offer grants to property owners, to groups of people who, it depends, and their regulations are constantly changing, so I don't want to quote stuff because it's going to go out of date tomorrow. But generally speaking, if you aggregate into large enough groups, say we manage 60 acres, you're going to be a whole lot better off applying for some of these grants than if you own half an acre and you're trying to apply for federal assistance on managing half an acre. Because the feds don't care about managing half an acre. They want to see big impacts for their dollar. Does that sort of make sense? So the other people to talk to, you can talk to the cooperative extension agents. If they've got a forest land advisor in your area, maybe they can help you with that kind of thing. So contact your National Resource Conservation Districts, contact your Resource Conservation Districts, your Cooperative Extension Service. Those are the people who are probably going to be able to help you work with your neighbors and qualify for grant funding to get bigger projects done. So that's an answer. I'm sure it's not the only one.
I just want to give a little plug, a little shameless plug for my nonprofit called soilcentric.org, because the profile on the speaker's thing is incorrect. That's my old organization that I worked for years ago. So Soil Centric, we've been aggregating different opportunities for people, farmers and non-farmers, land stewards, non-land stewards, ranchers, non-ranchers, and it is a platform that is in beta, which means it's a pilot right now, but you can go through and you can indicate your area of interest, and then it will make recommendations to you. So it's interactive and it's a recommendation tool with a lot of these ideas about how to get involved in regeneration. Shameless plug.
Okay, I think there are two quick questions maybe before we finish. One is about tick control, and people are accustomed to getting ticks when they go out in the open space and for hiking or something like that. What about tick bites in the garden? Is there a way we can control ticks? And the other question is about mosquito control. So there is spraying going on by the mosquito abatement districts. I don't know if anybody has any particular information on that yet.
So for reducing tick habitat in our gardens is mowing grassy areas. We can, if you have space or interest, you can bring in chickens, guinea hens, things like ducks. They do a really great job to reduce those type of pests, insects. Being aware of tick season. wearing clothes that are going to cover our bodies, so long pants, tall socks, long sleeves, things like that, doing tick checks when we go home, and then getting those clothes into the wash, but not just the wash, then into the hot dryer or some type of heat source, because if the tick is still, or any other insect is still on the clothes, they'll definitely die off in the heat cycle. From there, mosquitoes, we want to remove any type of, like a tablespoon of water anywhere on our property. And that could be a tarp that's covering our bicycles, or a wood pile, or anything like that. There could be a little divot, and there could be a little, pooling of water. Water in saucers from our containers. Even crotches of trees can actually hold little pockets of water. So we just kind of want to be aware of any space on our property that could be holding any little tiny pool of water. And it's very, very tiny, again, just a tablespoon. And then, gosh, yeah, I don't know, just,
I know.
yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
I'm blanking out.
No,
There's
I can
more.
hand it back to you when you
Okay.
remember. Then really quickly, I don't know how many people know this, but are you guys aware of why the West Coast has so many lower rates of Lyme disease than the East Coast does? Yeah, Western fence lizards. So one of the things that we should all think about doing, especially if we have ticks in our areas, is have a little rock wall someplace in our garden or something like that. And wooden fences away from your house can be a great thing, because Western fence lizards love fences. And imagine that. And the cool thing about Western fence lizards is, why do we care about Western fence lizards? They don't eat ticks, but the ticks bite the Western fence lizards. And the Western fence lizards have antibodies to Lyme's disease in their bloodstream, so they can clean the ticks. So that's why you want Western fence lizards in your yard. The problem is there are a few things that eat Western fence lizards, including people's cats. So try to keep your cats from eating the fence lizards. I'm not here to tell you how to deal with your cats, because that'll make me too many enemies. But if you can even just provide habitat for little rock piles for Western fence lizards, that'll help keep the West Coast a little bit of a better place to live.
Great.
I think there was one more question somebody asked me to answer. I think actually Greg answered it about wisteria. And I think you basically indicated that grape was a great plant to have on a trellis, but it was more what the trellis itself was made out of, right? If it's masonry and steel rather than wood, right?
Right, yeah, right.
And I think we've tried to get to most everybody. If for some reason I haven't, come and collar me in the next hour, and we'll try to get the answer for you. But I wanted to certainly thank all of our panelists, and also especially the organizers. And I hope that the discussion has certainly indicated how much we can gain by sharing information, and then also what we still need to learn. And so that's a good reason for everyone to start planning right now for next year's symposium. But I'll turn it over to